For the next 2 weeks, we'll be looking, well, not just at the Baptist Church, but starting with the Baptist Church. And then I want to discuss fundamentalism. Now, not all Baptists are fundamentalists, but when Bloom talks about Baptists, he jumps very quickly into this discussion of kind of Christian religious fundamentalism, which means we'll have to define that more. But for this week, it's a little reading heavy. There's not a lot to watch. There are a couple of short videos on religious freedom in America, and specifically Roger Williams, who was in some ways the founder of the Baptist Church in America. There's so many ways we could go with that, and I really haven't found. I have looked and looked over my time teaching this course, and I really haven't found a good kind of precise documentary about the history of the Baptist Church. For one, it's just hard to nail it down, right? What Baptist Church? Southern Baptist, American Baptist, Northern Baptist, Independent Fundamental Baptist. Because one of the core principles of the Baptist Church is kind of this individualistic freedom of conscience, it's really hard to nail down one organization. Now, probably the largest and most successful, just numerically speaking, and I may be wrong on this, you can check me on it, but would be at least the best known. Kind of one central organization would be the Southern Baptist. And interesting, like right now, just like some of the things that Bloom will look at, there are tensions and divisions within the Southern Baptist movement. Some of them theological. Roger Williams, who founded the First Baptist Church in America, was something of a Calvinist. But in the history of the Baptist Church, especially because of ties to like the Cane Ridge movement, those kind of revivalist movements, a lot of Baptists are not at all Calvinist. And because of this kind of central position of freedom of conscience and freedom of choice within religion, you don't get. It's not that all Baptists today are Calvinists. There is a real split theologically, even in the Southern Baptists. Some of their key leaders and speakers and teachers and theologians lean Reformed. Some of their more popular are Albert Mohler and Tim Keller. But there are plenty of others who are not at all Calvinist in their leanings. Very much kind of Arminian. This idea that God doesn't predestine people, that they choose whether or not they want to kind of become Christians. The message is offered to them, and they choose or not. So there's that division. There's some continuation of the divisions that Bloom wants to look at in his chapters, rooted in kind of social constructs, political stances, the place of women. So it's interesting. And if you're, interestingly enough, the Southern Baptist movement right now has had a lot going on. I believe it was one of their main seminaries just paid reparations for their involvement with slavery. There was a big movement to denounce and renounce the Southern Baptist connections to slavery and to white supremacy in the past. That because it was a Southern Baptist church, that Southern aspect came out of the Civil War. When the nation split, the churches in large part split. So officially the Southern Baptists have kind of said, no, we were wrong at that time to do that, and we're not going to, we're going to recognize our wrong, we repent of that, we turn from that. So it's there's a lot going on with Baptists, with Southern Baptists. There's a lot of diversity. If you just take the title Baptist, there's a tremendous amount of diversity between the types of Baptists. You will see in the video on Roger Williams specifically that Baptists, at least when the video was made, it's a little bit older, but not terribly old. Baptists were like 15% of the U.S. population. And if you consider those independent churches who, kind of evangelical independents, who have a similar theological and really in some ways are more Baptist than the Baptists because they're not part of any institution. They're not part of one of the key things for the Baptist church is the kind of self-determination of each local congregation. So when you look at the number of kind of small independent Bible churches that have basically kind of Baptist theologies, the impact of the Baptist movement is even far more vast than that 15%. But the other side of that is that like a third of all Baptists in the world live in the U.S. And I think this is kind of testimony to that idea. I talked about how I think Bloom misses it with Pentecostalism because he gets caught up in that kind of televangelist prosperity doctrine that is rather American. But Pentecostalism, so many Pentecostals worldwide and just not that many in the U.S. So it's hard to say this is a really American movement when it hasn't. I mean, it's got a solid basis in the U.S., but the Pentecostals don't have vast numbers statistically in the U.S. like they do in the rest of the world. Latin America, Southeast Asia, Africa, the percentage of Christians that are Pentecostal is just huge in comparison to the percentage of American Christians that are Pentecostal. Whereas on the flip side, Baptist churches really are kind of an American institution. In their history and their founding with Roger Williams and their ideals. This really commitment to the democratic control of each local congregation of itself, the freedom of the individual conscience in determining what their Christianity means and how to act it out. These things are very, very American. And they don't take as deep a root in many other cultures. The Baptist church is very anti-hierarchy. And so I do think, while I won't agree with everything that Bloom says in his chapters, the one thing that he definitely gets right is the Baptist church is a very American expression of a Christian religion. There is this desire to tie the Baptist church to kind of primitive Christianity, but just about all Christians have that. So that's nothing unique, right? If you talk to an Orthodox, they'll tell you that. I mean, if you look at an Eastern Orthodox Christian timeline of the church, they'll have this straight line that's the Orthodox Church going across, and the Catholic Church is breaking off, and this church is breaking off, and then you have the Catholic Church down here, and people break off of them. But they see themselves as the continuation of the primitive church. Same for the Roman Catholics. Most of the Protestants claim to be reforming and returning to the primitive church. So that aspect of you'll see things like fundamental Baptist or primitive Baptist that claim to be going back to like the earliest expressions of Christianity. That's not what makes them American. That's pretty common to most Christian movements, is the desire to be like the first Christians. But in this idea of freedom of kind of choice, freedom of conscience, governance of the local body by the local body, the rejection of hierarchy, those ideals that are core, you'll see them when you read the Baptist Faith and Message. Is a short document that just kind of lays out the basic ideals of what it means to be Baptist. Those core ideals are very American. So I think in that Bloom is correct. That said, I'm sorry there aren't more things to watch this time. It's rather reading heavy. We'll make up for that in the last couple of weeks, dealing with units on kind of the African American religious experience and American religion. But for this, we're going to look at the questions, some of the people that Bloom mentions, the different kind of takes on fundamentalism we'll start looking at um, within the early Baptist movements. So just kind of dig into these readings, do your best. They're not, I don't think they're too complex. The videos with Roger Williams should help, but I want you to get the grasp on this idea of freedom of religion, and you're going to read Jefferson's letter to this Baptist church. Understand that the idea of a wall of separation of a church and state and the kind of intense desire to secure religious freedom. Jefferson's letter is in response to comfort and to kind of remove concerns of a Baptist church. It's the Baptists that ask him for that, and he gives those. There is a wall of separation of church and state. He's borrowing from Roger Williams, probably knowingly, whether knowingly or not, this idea to comfort Baptists, because Baptists are formative in the ideas and ideals of religious freedom in the foundations of America, which points to the idea that realized that was not intended as a you can't take your religion into how you do government. It was meant as a people leaving a Europe where you could be discriminated against or persecuted or at certain points even put to death for not embracing the religion of the national government. It was seen as disloyal, it was seen as untrustworthy, it was seen as dangerous. If you don't embrace our religion, you might join our enemies and more. And that's what the kind of the separation of church and state that was there early on as kind of a Jefferson's offer to these Baptists that were concerned is to say the government is not going to establish a religion. The government is not going to violate your conscience on religion. And that was the key and central thing that is important to understanding what it means to be Baptist. So keep that in mind as you read. Bloom is going to take that very seriously, I think, and he values, as someone who kind of values this American ideal, that focus on conscience and the conscience of each individual. That is what he sees of value and of genius in the Baptist Church. There are other aspects of early divisions in the Baptist Church that he sees as very critically, and we'll talk even more about those next week.